Hello everybody, welcome back to the Mother's Choice channel. Today, we are here to interview our very own IB teacher, Miss Alice Mumby. We are so very much honored. As host today, I'm Jason and this is Javen, both in our very immaculate costumes. This is called color blocking, by the way, because it's blue and yellow.
It's lovely.
Thank you. So, the topic of choice for today, I believe, is adoption and its representation in literature, because Miss Mumby is an avid reader and connoisseur of literature, so who better to ask?
I am indeed both of those things. I'm also an English teacher as well. So hopefully I can help you learn something about the representation of adoption in literature. So one of the things I think that's quite interesting when you start looking into this topic is a lot of the issues to do with adoption in literature come into novels and other types of literature in the 19th century. So I don't know how much you know about the history of adoption in places like the UK at that time.
Not very much.
Yeah, not very much.
Yeah.
Would you care to elaborate?
So it's quite interesting, really, because obviously the UK, like many countries in Europe, went through an industrial revolution. And with that, a lot of people moved from the countryside and into urban areas. And with that as well, so the moving workforce and also the kind of rise of child labour as well. A lot of people were living outside of the communities that they lived in the past. And it also meant that in those urban populations, obviously wealth was quite a big factor, why people moved. And also when they had children, a lot of the time people had to think about their situation financially. So what happened in the 18th century was a lot of people started noticing in cities like London that there were a lot of children on the street. So there were a lot of babies left to die on the streets, and it became quite a big urban issue. So obviously this actually started to come into literature as well, because obviously literature often represents some of the issues that are happening at the time. So we see it in novels by people like Charles Dickens and the Bronte sisters and things like that.
I think one of the first books that we would like to talk about, like as a major point, would be Oliver Twist.
Yeah.
Because as you just said, kids are on the street very often, and they might end up being involved with gangs. Could you talk about how you think adoption is being represented in Oliver Twist?
Yeah, so Charles Dickens is an interesting one because he wrote his literature mostly as a form of social commentary. So he was a big philanthropist. So what that means is he's interested in giving, right? He's interested in giving to people who have less, but also he's very interested in poverty in London. And Oliver Twist, what we see in that novel is a young boy who ends up on the streets. He's orphaned, like many Victorian children, and he's taken in by this kind of gang of criminals. Now, obviously, we would like to not see adoption in this kind of way now in terms of modern representation, but actually Dickens has quite a nice ending to this story, which is that Oliver Twist is taken in by a kind of kind, benevolent older gentleman, and he ends up living quite a nice life. So we see a positive view of adoption in Oliver Twist, but we also see a lot of the troubles that young children experienced during this time as well.
Absolutely agree. Yeah, the gangs were a very big part of that. So, adding on to that, aside from the gang part, what other troubles do you think could befall upon orphan children or children who need to be adopted?
Yeah, so the concept of adoption, at least in Western literature, it changed over time. And adoption itself in the UK in particular changed over time as well. So originally, adoption was something that tended to happen within families. So it would be a child whose orphaned parents die because of sickness or war or whatever is then taken in by other family members. Usually we see the representations of this in literature as being quite traumatic for the child. So, for example, in Jane Eyre, when Jane is a young girl, she's orphaned and her aunt begrudgingly takes her in. And then she has quite an unhappy childhood. So often the portrayal of adoption in Victorian literature is to do with children who are left perhaps to another family member. They then may be treated unkindly and they have quite a difficult time. So Victorian literature interestingly perpetuates a lot of these, hopefully, myths about adoption as well, because the way that we see adoption now would perhaps be something much more positive than how it is portrayed in earlier forms of literature. Having said that, though, one thing I do think is really interesting about all of them is often we see characters maybe have some initial struggle, but then come to some kind of happy resolution where they find their own family in different ways. And that family is not necessarily the adoptive family. It could be that they marry someone when they get older and they start their own family. So we see lots of kind of like positive depictions of adoption as well.
Straying a bit away from the literature theme that we have going on, this adoption thing has also been represented adequately in movies as well. In one particular example that I like to talk about is Meet the Robinsons, where the main character is eventually adopted by a very, eccentric family. Have you ever watched that movie?
I have not watched that movie, Javen.
Then maybe we'll have to move our focus to somewhere else.
No, but I would still be interested to hear like what kind of view of adoption you get in that.
Because the movie does put its emphasis on two different children, one of which gets adopted because he's very good at science, and then he grows up to be this entrepreneur and innovator in the near future, while the other one, who does not get adopted, grows up to be the evil supervillain that does everything to take down the original main character. Well, it really just shows the two sides of how adoption can sometimes save the child from dire situations like this. But do you have anything to add, Jason?
Well, I think on top of that, they can save the children, absolutely. And beyond that, I think adoption introduces them to a new family. And the family, like as Ms. Mumby has stated, the family is what they make of it. Because and oftentimes the good ending that they end up getting can come from many different people they've never met. It can be extended family. It could be even, the people of their own. For example, one of the staple books in our primary school literature lessons was The Boxcar Children, and that story entails 4 orphan children who survive on their own without the help of adults. And to me, I feel like they are their very own family.
Yes. Yeah, I think that idea of the creation of families is quite interesting and definitely a theme that runs through other texts. So in Jane Eyre, for example, she has quite an unhappy childhood and she's adopted by her aunt, and she's treated very poorly compared with her cousins. But then as she grows up, she finds her own family in the form of Mr. Rochester and the new life that she leads. So what's interesting about some of these storylines is, although we see a certain element of struggle and sometimes, unfortunately, trauma as well, we also see some positive representations of the future that adoption can offer, and also new family as well, and the potential for that. Another thing that I have read about more recently, and this is a contemporary novel, but it's based on the Regency, so the Georgian period, where they actually created the first Foundling hospital in London. So in London in the late 18th century, a philanthropist actually established a hospital because he saw so many babies on the street. And it was a place where mothers could leave their children if they couldn't take care of them. And from there, those children would be adopted. And this hospital continued for many, many years. And it saved many children's lives. It was born out of this, obviously, need and poverty and things like that. But the novel, which is called The Foundling, and it's by Stacey Halls, tracks one child who's left there and who is actually reunited with her mother as well. So I think that that's also another interesting portrayal of a story that perhaps begins with struggle and this kind of impoverishment and things like that, but then becomes something a lot more hopeful.
Yeah, that's a beautiful story, I think, and definitely worth checking out. It's also very much akin to the work done by Mother's Choice, the organization, where they do try to help children find adopted families and, just have their own families, just generally, yeah. Do you have anything else to add?
You also mentioned The Secret Garden as one of the books that you think relates to the topic. And having not actually read it in its entirety, would you mind giving us a quick synopsis of it?
So I absolutely adored this novel when I was young. I have to admit, it's it's one of those ones that's so interesting because I don't know if you've read many novels that were written at this time. It's written in around 1911, I think, so it's kind of the beginning of the 20th century. And you have also The Little Princess, which is a similar kind of time. And it actually begins in colonial India, which is quite interesting. So when you read texts such as Mansfield Park by Jane Austen or The Secret Garden, one of the things you get is a bit of an insight into the British Empire. So you see how this young girl is orphaned because her parents die in colonial India. They die of, I think it's cholera. And then she has to move to the UK. Similar in The Little Princess, she has to leave India. Her mother dies and she leaves India and goes to boarding school in the UK. And so you get this kind of movement of people, which must only kind of exacerbate going through adoption as well, because you have displacement of people. And then in The Secret Garden, the young girl is put into the care of her uncle, and she has to adapt to England, she has to adapt to a new family. But also her portrayal as a character at the beginning is quite unforgiving. She doesn't seem to be a very nice person. And initially you don't really identify with her very much as a character. And her uncle, who's adopted her, is very absent. But she grows as a character. She kind of transforms. She makes friends with the other children near where she lives. She becomes kind of like a very kind figure. She's very kind to one of the boys who lives near her, and he's in a wheelchair. And at the end, her and her uncle have formed like a really close bond. So that's, interestingly, again, kind of like a story of adoption where it seems almost quite fraught and troubled at the beginning, but has quite a positive ending in terms of how she forges that new family life. So that's quite an interesting one. And I absolutely love that story. I would definitely recommend it to anyone.
If adoption is like a struggle in some depictions, would you say that finding found family would be the solution or the conclusion to the story?
Wow, that's a really tough question. I mean, I think that as with any big change that happens to people in their lives, there's often an initial, there's difficulties that we experience initially. One thing that I'm not always keen on in terms of some of the Victorian representations are how adoption and the adopted children are often mistreated or quite poorly treated. I think that sometimes that's quite negative, and obviously you would really hope that that's definitely not the case in modern adoption situations. However, I do also think, as you were saying, new families represent potentially a completely new life, so many opportunities that wouldn't otherwise be available, and family is so important for children. So I would like to think that at least we see that in all of these texts, even though some of the portrayals might be dated or sometimes a little bit harsh, maybe set very much in the context of their time and place. Hopefully we still get a positive view of the very optimistic potential of adoption.
I think that's great. I think another thing that we could bring attention to would be, as you mentioned, for example, in the Little Princess story, how at the start she is not very likable, or she can be a little troublesome, and that could point out the fact that how children who have not been raised with parents or like not been given a proper childhood may end up being more troubled, especially like the ones that don't get adopted until adulthood, which could mean that, you know, they characteristically don't develop as much as other people would. And so what do you think this says about the issue of children needing to be raised properly?
So that's quite an interesting one, because a lot of these books, since they're older, depict children in quite a different way anyway, because the Victorian and Edwardian view of children was quite different to perhaps how we would see children now. We know a lot more about child development, we know a lot more about psychology, we hopefully have a better understanding of children and how they should be treated when they're young. Victorian and Edwardian society saw children very much often as little less than small adults. So they were expected to work. There was an expectation that they should be able to behave themselves properly very quickly. There weren't many allowances given to children. And so I think that some of this partly comes from the quite unforgiving attitude that writers at this time probably had towards children. But also the idea of environment and how children need that kind of care to be properly appreciated and understood. I think Jane Eyre actually really tackles this quite well, because we feel sorry for her when she's mistreated, and we do feel like it's an injustice. The way when she's locked away in a room by her aunt for misbehaving, the reader understands that this isn't something that's fair. And so actually that's quite a progressive view of how children should be treated as well. And that's one of the reasons I like that text so much, is because it is quite progressive in its views of children and women. And so I think that maybe Charlotte Bronte was a little bit ahead of her time. And now we can appreciate, of course, that we need to be, you know, patient, understanding of people who go through some quite difficult experiences, including children.
You talk about children that have to grow up in these environments that may be hostile to them.
Yeah.
That reminds me of the book Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children, which I'm sure you guys have heard of, which is about peculiar children with superpowers who are ultimately adopted into a secluded home in the countryside because the outside world would not accept them for who they are. So that really ties in the whole found family trope, I guess.
Yeah.
But ultimately, I guess we need to transition to the next part, which is a bit more personal, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
You are a parent. Have you ever considered adoption?
Yes, I have. So I have two daughters who are twins. They're 7 years old. I think I know people who've adopted personally. I think that an adoption is an amazing thing. I think if I were to have more children, it would definitely be something that I would consider. I've seen many happily adopted children, and I've got many friends who've brought up adopted children. And I think it's really a positive thing. I suppose it's the same thing though with having a child. You always have to think about, you know, whether or not it's something, because it's a commitment, it's an investment, so you always want to make sure that it's something that you're going to be able to give your very best and all in. And so currently I've no plans to have any more children, but I do think that it's a really amazing and admirable thing. So my friends who've experienced it have experienced it in Hong Kong and also in Canada as well. And they have some quite interesting stories.
That's great. Thank you so much for your insight. I'm afraid that is all the time we have for today, but I've had the most wonderful times. And once again, we thank Ms. Alice Mumby very much for her time and helping out with the podcast today. We're very grateful. Well, there's some takeaways that we've had from today's very insightful and deep and thought-provoking discussion. For example, the concept of found family and how progressive adoption has been portrayed throughout history in literature as closer we get to modern times, so on and so forth. Do not forget to support the Mother's Choice YouTube channel, as well as our DBS Mother's Choice Instagram, which you'll be seeing both of this on. So, once again, thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll hopefully see you next time.